the last of our blood. When you lose everything, you start to understand just how fragile life is. For me, it happened twice. The first time was after my parents died, an accident, just a phone call I received late one evening, telling me that everything I knew had changed in an instant. I just graduated from college, barely out of the gate. Suddenly, I wasn't a kid with his life ahead of him. I was a guardian, a breadwinner, a caretaker. My younger brother, Bren, only in high school, had no one else but me. The second time was less sudden, but just as brutal. My job. I'd worked so hard to build up a stable life for us, to keep a roof over our heads. I thought it was secure, thought I'd done everything right. Then, out of nowhere, the layoff hit. The company I'd given years to, gone. That day, my heart sank, and I was left reeling, scrambling for the next paycheck, watching our savings drain day by day. We scraped by, somehow. I took any gig I could find. Those months felt like a constant battle to keep the lights on and food in the fridge. I was haunted by a lingering fear that if things could fall apart so easily once, they could do it again. I don't think Bren noticed much. He was still a kid. He saw the lights come on, the groceries in the fridge. None of it had the weight it did for me. Once I got back on my feet and landed another job, an IT position that, for all its monotony, was solid and paid decently, I realized I couldn't let myself get caught off guard again. It was a lesson the world had taught me, whether I wanted to learn it or not. That's how it started, my whole obsession with preparing. At first, it was nothing more than an extra can of beans here, a jug of water there. Whenever I went grocery shopping, I'd grab one or two items I thought we could store away. Bren would ask why we were getting so much soup, so much pasta, so many beans. Just in case, I'd say, but I could see in his eyes that he didn't understand. Maybe he didn't need to. Our place wasn't anything special, just a cramped one-bedroom in a rundown building. The walls were thin enough to hear our neighbors shouting on bad days, or the muffled sounds of someone's music on good ones. Bren and I shared that tiny space. He had the bedroom. I made do with the old couch in the living room. It wasn't much, but it worked, and for us, it was home. The daily rhythms of our lives had become well-worn, a quiet routine we both lived in but rarely shared. My days began early, slipping out of our apartment in the pale morning light, leaving Bren still wrapped up in sleep. I worked for a mid-sized IT company that occupied a few floors in a high-rise downtown. It wasn't glamorous most days. It was endless tickets, troubleshooting, and the hum of computers, all underscored by the occasional complaint from someone's lost file or crashed system. My desk was tucked in the far corner, isolated enough that I could get through most of the day with minimal interruptions, a window offering me glimpses of the city skyline as the day wore on. If I was lucky, I'd catch the sun setting on my break, a brief moment of color over the rooftops before plunging back into the pale glow of my monitor. Bren, on the other hand, started his day later. He'd drag himself up, muttering under his breath as he scrambled to grab his books and stuff everything into his backpack. School was just a few blocks from home, Rockwell High, with all the typical dramas he never fully let me in on. Teachers he'd vent about in vague terms, friends he hardly mentioned. The rebellious stage had hit him hard, and lately he seemed to push back on everything I said. Even small suggestions could lead to eye rolls and muttered responses. He was constantly testing boundaries, and while I tried not to let it get to me, sometimes I wondered how much distance had grown between us since our parents' accident. Losing them had forced him to close himself off, while it had pushed me into the role of his guardian, a title I didn't always feel ready for. By the time I got home in the evening, Bren was usually still out somewhere. Our routines brushed past each other, rarely intersecting. I'd drop my bag and settle into the couch, maybe unwind with a show or sometime organizing our supplies, a quiet effort that kept me grounded, even if he hardly noticed. Then he'd come in, headphones still in, scrolling his phone, and we'd exchange a few words, surface-level stuff, nothing too deep, before he'd disappear into his room. It was like he'd built walls around himself, and no matter how much I tried to reach out, he kept those walls intact. Our evenings, when we both were home, settled into an unspoken rhythm. I'd make dinner, something simple like stir-fry or pasta. Bren would drift out of his room when he was hungry, and we'd eat in silence, forks scraping plates, the hum of our apartment filling the empty spaces where conversation might have once been. Sometimes, I'd ask him about school, get a few half-hearted answers, and he'd retreat again, back into his world of posters, clothes scattered on the floor, and half-finished cups from previous nights. I'd linger outside his door now and then, hoping he'd invite me in or start a conversation. But he was stubborn, and I didn't know how to open that door without forcing it. On the rare nights we'd find common ground, we'd pick a movie and set up on the couch, pizza boxes spread out in front of us. Bren would pretend to be unimpressed, making sarcastic comments as we scrolled through endless choices, but I could tell he was interested. He'd settle in, occasionally throwing in a comment, but mostly quiet, just absorbed. It was the closest we came to connecting, and I held on to those moments, savoring them like tiny remnants of the life we'd lost. They were fleeting, but they reminded me of the bond we once had, a bond I was still trying to rebuild, piece by piece. Late at night, when the apartment was silent, I'd sometimes hear Bren's door creak open. I'd see him standing in the hallway, looking like he wanted to say something, but each time, he'd shake his head and turn back. Those moments weighed on me, filling the small space between us with an unspoken heaviness. We were both trying to survive in our own ways. He, by locking himself away, and me, by preparing for a future I couldn't fully predict. The distance between us was something I couldn't seem to bridge. We didn't talk about our parents much, or the accident that had taken them from us and left us here. He was just a kid then, and though I knew he was hurting, he rarely let me in. I kept hoping he'd open up eventually. Until then, I focused on the things I could control, our home, our safety, and our preparations. Maybe that was why I'd started obsessing over supplies, planning, stocking up for what I thought might be an emergency. It was something tangible, a way to feel in control when everything else seemed uncertain. I told myself I was doing it for Bren, to keep him safe. But maybe, deep down, it was for me too, a way to build some sense of security in a world where everything felt fragile. Our pantry wasn't a pantry at all. It was a narrow closet that should have been used for coats or shoes. Little by little, I transformed it into our stockroom, filling the bottom shelf with rice, pasta, and canned vegetables, packing supplies tight and counting each one. I didn't know it had a name back then. Prepping sounded too formal, too much like a hobby. I just knew that having a little extra around felt like a cushion, a small barrier between us and the next twist life might throw our way. At first, I aimed for 3 days' worth of supplies. Seemed reasonable enough, something to keep us going in case of a storm, a power outage, something minor. I bought canned foods that would last, bags of rice and beans, powdered milk, protein bars, anything that wouldn't spoil easily. I stored bottled water under Bren's bed and made a habit of rotating the can so nothing expired. It wasn't fancy, but it was a start. As the weeks went by, that 3-day goal began to feel flimsy. What if something bigger happened? What if I lost my job again, or some global disaster cut off our supply chain? Each trip to the store became a bit more purposeful. I watched for deals, kept an eye on expiration dates, and made sure every item I bought had a purpose. The closet filled up slowly, shelf by shelf. Bren didn't ask as many questions anymore, but I could see his curiosity. Sometimes he'd open the closet door, looking at the stacks of food, the rows of bottled water, the plastic containers filled with rice and beans. "Are you preparing for the apocalypse or something?" he asked one evening, a smirk on his face. "Just being careful," I replied. "You never know, Bren." He rolled his eyes, but I caught him taking a longer look at the closet before he closed the door. With each month, I stretched our goal further. 2 weeks of supplies, then a month. I began following forums online, finding tips from people who were much deeper into this than I was. They called themselves preppers, and they talked about things I'd never even thought of: power generators, long-term food storage, water purification. Their advice was practical, grounded in this shared understanding that the world wasn't as stable as it seemed. With each paycheck, I budgeted carefully. Bren's school expenses, rent, our daily food bills, all the essentials came first. But every now and then, I'd squeeze out a little extra for our stockpile. Sometimes it was a water filter. Other times, it was a bulk pack of canned chili. It wasn't much, just bits and pieces. But over time, those bits and pieces started to add up. Every corner of our apartment had something stashed: bottled water under the bed, canned food stacked neatly in the closet, a small plastic tub of medical supplies tucked behind the couch. I took quiet pride in it, this system I'd built piece by piece. It was like assembling a jigsaw puzzle, each item fitting together to form something larger. A sense of safety, of control. As I checked the news each morning, I noticed a different pattern. There was always something. An economic downturn, inflation on the rise, whispers of political conflict. Every headline seemed to stoke a little more anxiety, and I found myself reading them with a kind of grim fascination, searching for hints of what might come next. I knew it might sound paranoid to most people, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the world was getting more uncertain by the day. By the time I had enough supplies to last us 6 months, I felt a strange kind of calm. I'd run mental scenarios in my head, planned for every eventuality I could think of. Bren didn't really understand it, but that was okay. This was something I did for both of us, whether he knew it or not. My ultimate goal, though, was a full year's worth of supplies. It felt ambitious, almost absurd, but each time I saw a news story about rising food costs or another company laying off half its workforce, I felt my determination grow. One day I thought, Bren and I could have everything we needed to make it through no matter what happened. And maybe, in some twisted way, that would make up for everything we'd lost. Looking back, those days felt like slow preparation, a silent race against a shadow that hadn't fully shown its face yet. I thought I was getting ready for something familiar, a financial crisis, a job loss, maybe even a natural disaster. I thought I was covering all my bases, but sometimes you prepare for one thing, and life gives you another. The first hints were easy to overlook, just background noise in the usual chaos of daily life. But as I made coffee one morning, glancing at the muted headlines flashing on the TV, something unsettled me. Footage of empty grocery shelves, faces of people pressed against bank doors, fingers tapping impatiently on locked ATMs. They weren't unusual scenes in crisis zones, but this was close to home. It was small details at first, social media murmurs. People sharing stories of frenzied grocery store runs, panicked withdrawals from bank accounts, warnings of shortages. I skimmed a post about a mob storming a grocery store in a neighboring town, people elbowing each other over the last cases of water and canned goods. The video was blurry, grainy, and seemed exaggerated. Bren, always glued to his phone, brushed it off as clickbait. But my gut wouldn't let it go. I had a strange feeling, a low hum of anxiety that clung to me through the day. Each new video, each headline about food shortages and bank runs, added weight to that unease. I tried to shake it off, but that gnawing feeling only intensified as more reports surfaced. One night, as I was locking up after a long shift, a phrase floated through my mind. A piece of advice I'd come across years ago in a prepper forum. When you see people getting uneasy, trust your instincts. The next morning, my routine changed. I drove straight to the bank. When I got there, I could already see signs of the unease spreading. The line outside was long, people murmuring nervously, eyes darting from phones to the locked doors. I joined the line, my heartbeat quickening as I overheard conversations of shortages, rumors that some banks were already low on cash. When it was finally my turn, I didn't hesitate. I took out everything I was allowed to, every last dollar. The teller's eyes lingered on me for a moment, silent judgment flickering across her face, but I didn't care. Better to be prepared than regretful. Back at home, I unpacked the bills carefully, hiding them in an old safe under the bed. The next few nights, I went straight from work to any open grocery store, filling my cart with canned goods, bags of rice, dried beans, bottled water, anything that would last. Bren watched me stack the shelves, a smirk crossing his face. "Andy, seriously, it's just rumors. People are panicking over nothing," he said. Leaning against the kitchen counter, his arms folded. But the more I saw, the harder it was to shake my unease. Each night I kept the news on, following updates from cities across the country. Videos emerged, shaky and chaotic, of people scuffling in stores, frenzied shopping sprees that stripped shelves bare. Bren started watching the clips too, a furrow deepening between his brows, though he didn't say much. Then the tone shifted. Anchors, once casual, now spoke in low, somber voices. There were mentions of an unknown virus creeping into urban centers. People were getting sick, doctors said, but this wasn't any regular illness. The symptoms were strange, aggressive, patients changing in ways that had hospital staff bewildered and frightened. On a Tuesday afternoon, the government issued a public announcement. News anchors repeated the same message over and over with a palpable sense of dread. Stay indoors. Avoid contact with others. My hands felt cold as I heard those words. It was too familiar, a scene I'd pictured so many times before in late-night prepper forums. People scrambling, panicking, and all the while, something darker waiting on the horizon. That evening, the tension at work was thick enough to cut through. I'd kept the news on low volume in the corner of my screen, just enough to catch any breaking reports. Each new headline seemed to hint at a bigger problem than the one before. Banks were freezing accounts. Grocery shelves were emptying faster than stores could restock. And then, in the midst of the usual updates on food shortages and riots, something unusual flickered across the screen. A news clip that made my heart skip a beat. I turned up the volume. Unconfirmed reports have surfaced, showing disturbing footage from several cities. Authorities urge the public to remain calm, though investigations into these videos are ongoing. The footage that followed was grainy, like something pulled straight out of a low-budget horror flick. But it was enough to make the air feel heavy in my office. A shaky phone video, recorded in some anonymous alley, showed people, or what looked like people, stumbling aimlessly, their movements jerky and disjointed, like marionettes on broken strings. And in the next moment, one of them lunged at a passerby, sinking its teeth into the person's shoulder. The screams, distorted and distant, echoed as the camera shook violently, then cut off. The screen returned to the anchor, her face pale but composed. Authorities are treating these as isolated incidents. Law enforcement is working to confirm the authenticity of these recordings. I glanced around at my co-workers. Most of them had either looked away, brushing it off as another internet hoax, or had their brows furrowed, unsure whether to believe what they'd seen. A nervous laugh broke the silence. "People will believe anything these days," someone muttered, shaking their head. but I couldn't shake the sense of dread pooling in my stomach. I'd seen fake videos before, sure, CGI-enhanced clips of so-called zombies that went viral every Halloween. But there was something about this footage, the rawness of it, that felt real. Too real. As the anchor continued, more footage rolled in, and each clip was eerier than the last. Shadowy figures with blood-smeared faces roaming deserted streets, others pounding frantically on locked doors, their hands leaving dark, smeared marks on the glass. In one video, a woman screamed as something tackled her to the ground, and the camera tilted away just as her screams cut off abruptly. Bren had been messaging me, sending me snippets of the footage that he'd seen popping up on his social media. Each message came with a short text like, "Look at this," or "Do you think it's real?" Back at my desk, my hands itched with the impulse to bolt out of the office. Something massive was unfolding and I needed to be ready. But then, another message came through on my phone. This time, it was a government alert. Stay home, avoid contact with others, await further instructions. It was the first official warning, and it was the only confirmation I needed. I packed up my things quickly, ignoring the bewildered looks from my coworkers, and made for the exit. Leaving the office, I could feel a strange heavy tension hanging in the air, making every breath feel weighted. The streets outside were packed, more crowded than usual for this time of day, with cars creeping forward at an agonizingly slow pace. People on the sidewalks moved with urgency, some glancing over their shoulders, others frantically tapping at their phones. Instinct told me to head straight home, but I knew the supply situation was growing dire. If I don't stock up now, we'd be left with just what I'd managed to store away so far. I slipped into the nearest store, my pulse quickening as I took in the scene. Aisles were practically empty, shelves stripped bare. Every few feet, a lone can or damaged box lay abandoned on the floor. I quickly moved down the aisles, grabbing anything I could, canned goods, instant noodles, whatever could last. Shoppers around me were in a frenzy, yanking items off shelves without a second thought, each movement driven by mounting desperation. The further I went, the more it became clear that I wasn't the only one with survival on my mind. At the end of the aisle, two men were locked in a brutal struggle over a bag of rice. Their faces were red with rage, veins bulging as they yanked and twisted, grunting with effort. The sight shook me. This wasn't just panic buying anymore, this was survival, raw and unfiltered. I backed away slowly, hoping they wouldn't notice me, but the thought hit me like a punch to the gut. I had supplies at home, sure, but what if someone tried to take them? I didn't have a way to protect myself or Bren if things turned violent. With a growing sense of urgency, I made my way to the kitchenware section, hoping to find anything I could use to defend myself. But when I arrived, it was nearly stripped bare. Broken glass and random utensils were scattered across the floor, the aftermath of people grabbing anything with even a hint of a sharp edge. I pushed past it, glancing over empty hooks and shelves, feeling my frustration rise. That's when I remembered the sporting goods section. I darted over, weaving between people in their frantic searches. There, resting on top of a shelf, was a lone golf club. I stretched up, grabbing it, and tested its weight. It felt solid in my hands, reliable. Not the best, but definitely better than nothing. I headed toward the exit, gripping the club tightly, when I spotted a display of seed packets nearby. Something in me made me pause. I knew it sounded strange, but these little things could mean a shot at some long-term survival. I grabbed everything that's left, stuffing them into my bag. With that done, I decided to check the gardening section, hoping for something a little more substantial. I found a collapsible shovel on a rack and tested its weight. Heavy, durable, and capable of doing some damage if needed. A pair of gardening shears glinted nearby, and I grabbed those too, sliding them into my bag. As I turned to leave, I caught sight of a fight breaking out by the entrance. People were shoving each other, swinging fists, desperation turning them feral. I clutched the golf club tighter, ducked my head, and hurried out, hoping no one would notice me. Outside, the street was a mess. The usually calm, controlled traffic had devolved into chaos. Cars were honking, people yelling, and the blaring lights of an ambulance were barely visible through the throng. I quickly made my way to my car and jumped in, but as I joined the line of cars inching forward, the dread began to sink in. I pulled out my phone and dialed Bren, hoping he was already home, safe. The line rang over and over before going straight to voicemail. I tried again, but it was the same, no answer. My heart raced as I stared out at the sea of unmoving cars around me, every wasted second feeling like a punch to the chest. I cursed under my breath. If I hadn't stopped for supplies, I might have been home by now. But I couldn't change that now. All I could do was hope he'd gotten back to the apartment and wasn't out somewhere caught in this chaos. The sounds around me grew more intense, honking, yelling. A distant siren wailing through the din. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, every muscle in my body tense, and my eyes flicked to the street ahead, looking for any opening to get me moving. The usual 20-minute drive home had stretched into 30, and I was nowhere close to getting out of the bottleneck. Every inch forward felt like a fight. Bumper-to-bumper cars, wedged tight, and the chaos on the streets outside was making it worse. People were abandoning vehicles left and right, ducking into alleys or sprinting down sidewalks. My fingers tapped anxiously against the steering wheel, and every so often I'd pick up my phone to call Bren. No answer. I left him another message, urging him to get home immediately, lock the doors, and keep the windows closed. The radio crackled with scattered updates, reports of violence, bizarre riots, and a strained government announcement advising people to stay indoors, to shelter in place. My thoughts raced through worst-case scenarios, but I kept circling back to Bren. He was out there somewhere, possibly still at school, and I was stuck, helplessly wedged in a jam. Another alert broadcast over the radio, more urgent this time. There was no holding back now. The tone in the announcer's voice screamed of things spinning wildly out of control. People who were listening started abandoning their cars en masse, and I felt a new surge of urgency. If I stayed here, stuck in this car, I'd be a sitting target. I had to move. I grabbed my go-bag from the trunk and stuffed it with essentials. The seeds I'd picked up, the shears, a few cans of food, whatever would fit, went inside. I clipped the collapsible shovel to the outside of the bag and took a final look around the car. My golf club was in hand, a makeshift weapon if it came down to it. With a deep breath, I swung the bag over my shoulder, locked the car, and joined the panicked crowd. The streets were worse than I'd imagined. People were rummaging through abandoned cars, tearing open bags, snatching anything they could find. A man yelled as two people dragged him to the ground, clawing at his belongings with no hint of remorse. I held back, dodging out of sight and sticking to the shadows, my grip tightening on the golf club. The noises around me grew louder, screams, shouts, and the low thuds of fists and feet. I moved faster, dodging the chaos, my mind fixated on one thing: Bren. I had to get home, get to him, make sure he was safe. The distance was grueling. Every step forward was another reminder of just how fragile our situation had become. Then I saw it. A man stumbling, his face pale and slack, with eyes that looked hollow. A woman was screaming, backing away, but he lunged, his movements jerky and unnatural. The scene unraveled in sickeningly slow motion. He tore into her, snarling as he sank his teeth into her arm. The shock of it rooted me in place, but only for a heartbeat. Infected. It had to be what they'd been warning about. My body moved on instinct as I bolted from the scene, my breath ragged, my senses sharpened. Every shadow seemed to pulse with danger, every sound a potential threat. I kept running, pushing through the growing dread, Bren's face flashing in my mind with every step. The world was unraveling around me, but I had one goal: get home. Get to Bren. The chaos around me grew fiercer as I drew closer to our neighborhood. The air was thick with the sounds of sirens, desperate shouts, and the gut-wrenching wails of people trapped in nightmare scenarios. I ducked behind a parked car, my heart hammering in my chest as I surveyed the street. The world around me was dissolving into complete madness. Just a few blocks from home, I caught sight of a small group of teenagers in jerseys from Bren's school, their faces pale and strained with fear. They looked lost and disoriented, glancing over their shoulders with wide, panicked eyes. I took a few careful steps forward, my voice low but urgent. "Do you guys know Bren? Bren Adams?" They turned to me, but they were too panicked to answer. One of them glanced my way, his gaze hollow, before they stumbled off, practically tripping over one another as they ran. Their fear was contagious, seeping into my skin. I tried calling Bren again, pressing the phone against my ear as if sheer force could get him to answer. No response. I moved faster, winding my way through the final stretch of streets, every nerve alive with the fear that something, anything, could jump out at me from the darkened alleyways. When I finally spotted our apartment building, relief flooded over me. I slipped my key into the gate, pushed it open, and stepped inside, breathing a sigh of relief as the gate clanged shut behind me. The relative quiet in the building's hallway felt surreal, almost a tease of normalcy in a world that was unraveling. I climbed the stairs to the third floor, my legs shaking with exhaustion, anticipation, and dread. Reaching our door, I fumbled with the key, already feeling a spark of safety, a whisper of reassurance that Bren might be inside. I pushed open the door and stepped inside, calling out, "Bren?" Silence. The dread punched me harder than anything I'd felt all night. The apartment was empty. Bren wasn't home. Every ounce of relief drained from me, replaced by raw panic, a hollowing sense of fear. My phone felt cold in my hand as I tried calling him once more. Voicemail again. I moved to the kitchen table, grabbing a notepad and scrawling a quick note with a hand that barely felt steady. "Bren, I went to your school to look for you. If you're reading this, lock the door, don't let anyone in, stay home and wait for me. I'll come back. I promise." The promise tasted like ash, but it was all I had to give him. Leaving the heavy weights for my bag, I swung my go bag over my shoulder, my grip firm on the golf club. I locked the door behind me, glancing down the dark hallway with a lingering feeling of uncertainty. With every fiber of resolve I had left, I set out toward Bren's school. Navigating the dark streets, each step driven by a desperation that seemed to drown out everything else. As I sprinted through the deserted streets, my pulse thudded in my ears, and every shadow seemed to ripple with menace. Bren was out there alone, probably terrified, and I needed to reach him. The world around me felt hostile, with each minute amplifying the urgency clawing at my mind. A sudden shuffle ahead made me press myself against a nearby wall, clutching my golf club so tightly my knuckles whitened. Figures lurched past me, moving with that strange, erratic twitch I'd started to recognize. I held my breath, hoping the darkness would shield me. When they finally stumbled past, I exhaled, feeling my pulse slow. Just a bit. But my relief shattered in an instant when, just up the street, I spotted someone else struggling, her terrified cries slicing through the silence. It was a woman I recognized from my building, her arm trapped in the iron grip of an infected. She thrashed, trying to break free, and without thinking, I charged forward, yelling and swinging my club as hard as I could. My first blow landed on its back, the impact barely phasing it. I struck again and again, but the creature just turned toward me, its lifeless eyes honing in on my face. Panic surged, and I swung wildly, feeling myself start to tire. Then came a sharp crack, and the creature fell to the ground. I looked up, panting, to see Roy, one of the men from my building, standing beside me, a bloodied wrench in his hand. He gave me a quick nod, his expression hardened. "Go for the head," he advised, still catching his breath. "At least, that's what the movies tell us." My laugh came out shaky, more nervous than anything. "I know, I just couldn't, I'm not built for this." Roy studied me for a second, giving me a knowing look. "Better get used to it quick, look." I glanced back at the woman, now unsteady on her feet, her face twisted into something unnatural as she lunged toward us, her eyes glazed over. Roy didn't hesitate. He brought the wrench down with brutal precision, and she crumpled at his feet. "Zombie bites, they spread," he murmured, wiping a hand across his brow. "That's what." "Yeah," I cut him off, nodding as adrenaline raced through me. "The movies have told us." Roy snorted, shaking his head. "All right, Mr. Movie Buff." He cast another glance at me like he was measuring my resolve. "What are you doing out here anyway?" I swallowed, steadying myself. "Looking for my brother, Bren. He's still at school, and he's not answering his phone." Roy gave a small nod, his gaze hardening. "Well, I got no one waiting for me at home. I might as well help you find him. You don't look like you'd survive another attack." A strained chuckle slipped out, masking my nerves. "What makes you think that?" He grinned, a bit of humor breaking the tension. "You practically jumped out of your skin back there. Looked like you were about to shit yourself." I couldn't help but laugh, the sound bitter and absurd. "All right, fair enough. Thanks, Roy." He clapped me on the back, his voice turning serious. "Come on, Bren's school isn't far. We'd better hurry if we want to bring him home." With Roy at my side, I turned toward the looming darkness. Each block felt more dangerous, but now a faint hope crept in alongside the fear. The darkness stretched long over the school's back gate as Roy and I slipped inside, our nerves prickling with every sound. The campus was eerily quiet, yet the disarray around us spoke volumes. Scattered notebooks and backpacks littered the ground, testament to the panic that had torn through just hours earlier. Roy cast a glance around before looking at me, his brow furrowed. "Any idea where Bren might hang out?" I swallowed, taking in the foreign hallways and silent classrooms. "Not really. I've only ever dropped him off at the front. Never actually been inside." I tried calling Bren's phone one more time, but still no answer. The silence on the other end was deafening. The school was a maze of overturned desks and scattered belongings. We moved cautiously, checking each classroom and building, feeling the weight of the emptiness. The lights flickered overhead, casting long, unsettling shadows. With every empty room, my chest tightened. As we entered yet another classroom, I dialed Bren's number again. This time, the silence was broken by the faint sound of a ringing phone. My heart jumped, and Roy and I exchanged a look. Following the sound, we finally found Bren's bag slung under a desk, his phone still buzzing inside. I reached out, holding it in my hand as a crushing weight of hopelessness settled in. I clenched my jaw, gripping the bag like it was a lifeline. He left his phone. He wouldn't just leave it. Roy put a hand on my shoulder. "Look, I checked every face of everybody we passed, all right. Bren's not here. Maybe he made it out another way." I looked down, struggling to hold on to that sliver of hope. "Yeah, maybe he went home." Roy gave me a reassuring nod, his voice steady. "Let's get back, Andy. It's only getting darker, and we need somewhere safe to rest. We'll look again tomorrow, first thing." Every instinct told me to keep searching, to not stop until Bren was by my side. But the empty halls, the chilling silence, the oncoming night, all of it pressed down on me, and the urgency of Roy's words sank in. He was right. Out here in the dark, we were sitting ducks. We turned towards the exit, moving cautiously down the hallways as we neared the front gate. Suddenly, we heard it, a faint banging noise echoing from nearby. I froze, my pulse quickening. The sound grew louder, and I recognized it. Doors being pounded from the inside, coming from the gymnasium. Roy turned to me, his expression serious. "What do you think? Could it be?" I took a shaky breath, steeling myself. Only one way to find out. Roy and I inched closer to the gym, the ceaseless banging reverberating down the empty hallways. With each step, a glimmer of hope sparked in me. Maybe, just maybe, Bren was in there. The darkness hung heavy around us, but none of that mattered. I was bringing Bren back. Roy's voice cut through my thoughts, his tone low. "It's chained from the outside." "So?" I answered, my voice sharper than intended. "It means someone wanted to keep whoever or whatever is in there from getting out." His expression was wary, his eyes darting between the door and me. Ignoring his caution, I called out, Bren, are you in there?" The banging grew more frenzied, and a new sound joined the cacophony. Haunting, guttural moans and low growls that set my nerves on edge. Roy gripped my shoulder, a dark look crossing his face. I didn't know waking up the dead was part of the plan. I gulped, his words hitting home, but Roy didn't hesitate. He moved toward the chain, wrench in hand, and with a quick look in my direction, he said, "Now, stand back." He raised the wrench, hammering away at the padlock. I gave him a pointed look. "Oh, because that's quieter than calling for Bren, right?" Roy just rolled his eyes, landing a final blow that sent the padlock clattering to the ground. "Get ready," he whispered. "Hit whatever comes out with all you've got. And maybe this time, don't shit yourself." I tightened my grip on the golf club, trying to steady my breath as he opened the door. Two infected came lunging toward us, their eyes blank with rage. Roy took down the first with a single, solid swing. I aimed for the second, but missed, and before I could react, it barreled into me, knocking me to the floor. Its twisted face loomed close, snapping and clawing with a terrifying hunger. I struggled, every movement slowed by the sheer weight of panic. With a quick pull, Roy wrenched the infected off me, shoving it back toward the gym. He lifted his wrench to finish it off, but I held up a hand, catching my breath. "Let me do it." He stepped back, nodding as I steadied myself. I lifted the golf club, my hands shaking, and fixed my eyes on the creature. A chilling, disfigured face that reminded me just how high the stakes had become. My hands shook as I raised the golf club, feeling its weight as I aimed at the infected's twisted, dead face. I swung down with everything I had, the impact jarring through me as it crumpled under the blow, finally still. I stood over it, breathing hard, a mix of horror and relief filling me. I stared at the lifeless infected sprawled on the floor, its face battered beyond recognition. The reality of what I'd just done hit me like a wave, but I forced myself to stay focused. Roy patted my shoulder, a rare moment of warmth in his usually tough exterior. "Good job, you handled it," he said with a nod of approval. I took a deep, shuddering breath, steadying myself as we scanned the dim gym. Every shadow seemed to shift, every sound sharp and threatening. My heart raced as I called out, my voice echoing off the empty walls. Bren, are you here?" For a moment, silence swallowed the gym. Then, a faint voice, barely audible, came from the far end. "Andy, is that you?" Relief surged through me. I sprinted toward the sound. Bren, I shouted, desperately hoping I hadn't just imagined his voice. The doors at the far end of the gym slowly creaked open, and out stepped Bren, looking just as worn and frightened as I felt. My knees almost buckled with relief. Without thinking, I ran to him, wrapping my arms around him. For a few seconds, we held each other, both of us too relieved to speak. Then, remembering where we were, we broke the hug, the awkwardness settling in as we stepped back. "Where the hell have you been?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Bren pointed toward the 2 dead infected on the gym floor, his face pale. We were cleaning the storage area after class, then we heard screams. Like, a lot of screaming. We came out to check and saw them. They were normal at first, and then one of them started bleeding everywhere. I tried to help him, but then he just snapped like he went mad. He attacked the other guy and... Bren shook his head, haunted. After that, we hid in the storage room until we heard you calling. I frowned, taking in his words. You watched all those news. There's chaos everywhere. And you chose to clean storage. And wait, do you say we? From behind him, a girl cautiously stepped forward, looking nervous and just as shaken as Bren. She had wide, uncertain eyes and a faint flush on her cheeks. I'm Gwen Zoe, she said, giving me a small, anxious smile. Bren's, girlfriend? I blinked. Girlfriend? Since when? That was news to me. I quickly gathered myself. Andy Adams, I said, offering her a nod before motioning to Roy. And this is Roy, just Roy. He lives in the same building as us. Roy shot Bren a knowing grin, raising an eyebrow. Cleaning the storage area, huh? He gave a playful wink. Bet you're cleaning it pretty often, then. Bren's face turned a deeper shade of red, and he tried to say something, but I cut in, shaking my head. All right, enough. Let's focus on getting out of here. I handed Bren his backpack. Next time you're, cleaning with your girlfriend, at least remember your phone. I shot him a look. And maybe bring some condoms. Bren muttered, but we were just cleaning, his face going bright red again. Gwen covered her mouth, trying to stifle a nervous laugh. I could feel the tension easing for just a moment, but a faint, sickening sound from outside, the groans and shuffles of more infected, quickly reminded us of the reality waiting beyond these walls. Roy straightened up, his wrench still in hand, and nodded toward the exit. We need to move. The longer we stay, the more of them there'll be. I met Bren's eyes, squeezing his shoulder. We're getting home, Bren. All of us. He nodded, the fear and gratitude clear in his gaze. Without another word, we all moved toward the gym's exit, stepping cautiously, every noise amplified in the silence. We had no idea what waited outside, but for now, we had each other, and that was enough to keep going. With Roy leading the way, we slipped through the quiet streets like shadows, careful to stay hidden. Bren and Gwen followed close behind him, with me taking up the rear, clutching my golf club as my eyes darted around, scanning for any threat. We moved in silence, each of us tense, dodging people who staggered by with lifeless eyes and twisted expressions, their movements jerky and wrong. The infected were everywhere, attacking anyone unlucky enough to cross their path. At one point, we huddled in the dark corner of a parking lot as an infected man tackled a terrified woman to the ground just a few feet away. The sounds of her desperate screams and his guttural growls echoed in my ears, chilling me to the core. I felt Gwen press closer to Bren, both of them trembling as they clung to each other. We kept low, waiting until the sounds faded before inching forward again. The tension was suffocating as we maneuvered through the alleys and side streets, avoiding the infected as best we could. But just as we thought we were in the clear, a shuffling sound caught my attention. From behind us, an infected came barreling out of the shadows, its mouth open in a sickening snarl. It lunged straight at me, its decayed hands clawing through the air. I barely had time to react. With a surge of adrenaline, I swung my golf club as hard as I could, smashing it across the infected's head. It dropped to the ground with a sickening thud, twitching once before lying still. I glanced at Bren, who stared at me with wide, awe-filled eyes. I couldn't help feeling a swell of pride until Roy chuckled, breaking the moment. "Showing off for your little brother now, huh?" he snickered, giving Bren a mock-serious look. Just wait until you see him really scared. Your brother's a real pro at shitting his pants." Bren laughed nervously, shaking his head, while Gwen stifled a small smile. The moment of levity was brief, but it was enough to ease some of the fear as we kept moving. Finally, after what felt like hours, we made it back to our building. My heart leapt with relief as I fumbled with my keys, eager to get us inside, but the door wouldn't budge, no matter how hard I twisted the lock. Panic clawed at me as I jiggled the handle, pressing my shoulder against the door. It was barricaded from the inside. "What?" I whispered, a sense of dread creeping over me. I tried calling out, but the building was silent, with no sign of anyone on the other side. Roy tested the fire exit door, but it too was locked. He banged a fist against it in frustration. Damn it, they've locked everything down. I could feel the weight of the day pressing down on me. All I'd wanted was to get home, to keep Bren safe. Now, after everything, we were back but couldn't even get to our supplies, couldn't get to safety. I glanced at Bren and Gwen, both looking lost and scared. The exhaustion and disappointment clawed at me, but I forced myself to stay focused. Roy's voice broke the silence, his tone calm but firm. "We can't stay here. Those things will be out in full force soon. We need to find somewhere safe for the night and regroup in the morning." I nodded, the urgency of his words grounding me. "All right," I said, gripping my club tighter. As we made our way through the darkened streets, the realization that we might be spending the night outside sunk in. We kept checking every door we passed, knocking quietly enough not to draw any unwanted attention, but loud enough for anyone inside to hear. But each knock was met with silence, and no doors opened for us. Finally, at the corner, I spotted the laundromat. Its door was slightly ajar, left open by someone in a rush. "Here," I whispered to the others, gesturing toward it. Bren shot me a skeptical look, glancing at the glass walls that wrapped around the front of the laundromat. "Are you sure we'll be safe in there?" "It's just for one night," I replied, keeping my tone steady. "We stay quiet, no lights, no sounds, and we'll be fine." Roy nodded in agreement. "Better than out here, that's for sure." We moved in tense and careful, Bren and Gwen sticking close behind me while Roy took up the rear. Roy held the door until I signaled that it was clear. I checked each corner of the laundromat, my heart pounding, until finally I found myself in the backroom office. It was cluttered with papers and bags of laundry, but thankfully empty. "It's all clear," I called softly to Roy, who locked the door behind him as the others filed in, letting out sighs of relief. Gwen began gathering a few scattered bedsheets and blankets, her voice quiet but practical. "We should hang these to cover the glass." Bren immediately moved to help her, and together they draped the sheets over the glass walls to give us a sense of safety, or at least enough to keep us hidden from anyone or anything that might walk by outside. Roy leaned back against the door, catching his breath while I dug into my backpack, pulling out the few supplies I have. Bottled water and a couple of snack bars. I handed them out, everyone taking a sip or a bite in silence. Once we'd eaten, I volunteered to keep watch, wanting to keep my nerves busy with something. I motioned for the others to settle down and get some rest, though I could feel Bren's anxious eyes on me. "You all get some sleep. Bren, Gwen, you need it. And Roy," I gave him a half smile. "Our old man here especially needs it." Roy chuckled softly, shooting me a look before closing his eyes and settling in. One by one, they each drifted off, exhausted from the day's terror and uncertainty. As I sat by the door, gripping my golf club, I kept my ears tuned to every sound in the quiet laundromat. The night pressed in, heavy and still, as I kept watch over them, silently praying that we all make it through to see the morning. The whole night, I'd tried calling our landlord, but every attempt was met with that same infuriating busy tone. I kept myself awake with the hope that one call might actually go through. But as exhaustion crept over me, I ended up nodding off by the door, still clutching my phone. I woke with the sun streaming in through the makeshift curtains that Gwen and Bren had draped over the laundromat's glass walls. Roy was already up, stretching and rubbing his neck, muttering something about old bones not being built for hard floors. Just as the rest of us were starting to stir, a piercing scream cut through the morning quiet, followed by a loud crash outside. We snapped to attention, tense as we looked out the window, and saw a group of survivors being ambushed by infected. It was chaos. The infected charged with terrifying speed, the surviving group fighting desperately to fend them off. Bren, visibly shaken, turned to me, his voice barely a whisper. "Shouldn't we help them?" Roy glanced over with a grin, aiming a jab my way. "What do you think, Sleeping Beauty? Some night guard you turned out to be." I shot him a half smile but shook my head, focusing on the brutal scene outside. "It's too late," I said, voice weighed with the hard truth. "There are already too many of them, and those survivors, they'll be infected any minute. We'd just be adding ourselves to the body count. Roy and I can't take that many, not even close." Roy raised an eyebrow, his usual humor not quite masking his own unease. "I could handle him easy enough," he teased, flashing me a grin. "Not so sure about you, though," he added with a smirk. "We'll stay put until it's clear," I said, ignoring his taunt. "Once the coast is clear, we'll make a break for our building." Roy sank back, resting his head against the wall, and let out a sigh. "Got a fresh cup of coffee hidden in that bag of yours?" I grinned. "Once we get back home, I'll make you the best cup of coffee you've ever had." We settled into a tense silence, watching the scene outside play out as the infected tore into the survivors. Slowly, the cries faded, leaving only the groans of the newly turned shambling around the street. When everything calmed, I got up and started searching around the laundromat for anything useful. In the back room, I stumbled upon a few gallons of bleach, and as I stuffed them into my bag, I scribbled a quick note promising to pay, hoping that someday normalcy might return. Roy caught me glancing at the note as I slipped it into my pocket. "You really think we'll be back to normal someday?" he asked, his voice quieter than usual. I looked at him, struggling to find the right words. "I don't know, Roy," I finally replied, the weight of uncertainty pressing down on all of us. The silence grew thick until Bren's voice broke through. "It looks clear outside now." He was peeking out through the curtains, his face a mix of hope and nerves. Roy and I moved over to confirm, and sure enough, the infected had scattered for now, leaving the street quiet and still. Taking a steadying breath, I gathered everyone close. "All right, we head straight to the building, keep quiet, and try to get someone inside to let us in. If we don't get an answer..." Gwen, her face lined with worry, asked, "And if no one answers?" "Then we find cover in one of the cars," I said firmly, hoping to ease her nerves. "We'll wait there until someone from inside spots us and can let us in." With one last nod, we slipped out of the laundromat, moving as silently as possible. Our nerves were frayed, but we moved as one, ready to make it home, or as close to home as we could get. We slipped out of the laundromat and moved as quietly as we could towards our apartment building. The streets were eerily empty, yet every rustling sound and distant moan reminded us that danger lurked in every shadow. Roy led the way, checking each door as we passed, hoping for a miracle. But it was still the same as last night. The main door barricaded from the inside and the fire exit firmly locked. With no immediate way in, we quickly took cover behind some parked cars. Roy hid behind a dented sedan directly across from the building, positioning himself so anyone peeking out the windows could see him. Bren, Gwen, and I huddled between two cars in the open lot beside the building, crouched low to avoid attention. Just as we started to feel stuck, an idea hit me. I pointed to a familiar beat-up car nearby. Wait a second. This car belongs to Mrs. Castro, the cat lady. She lives just a floor below us, facing the street. Bren glanced at the car, nodding. Yeah, I can tell. Just look at those cat plush toys in the back. So what? What's in it for us? If she's home, she could let us in, I whispered, my voice barely concealing a glimmer of hope. Bren's face lit up, though he immediately followed with the obvious question. But how do we get her attention? Gwen glanced around the lot and spotted a handful of loose rocks scattered nearby. We could throw some of these at her window, she suggested, holding up a rock. Bren and Gwen quickly gathered a few, and we all moved to the front of the building. Bren volunteered to throw the rocks, and I pointed out the window I thought belonged to Mrs. Castro. Bren took a deep breath and lobbed the first rock. It bounced off the brick just below her window. He cursed under his breath, adjusting his aim and throwing again. Some of his throws missed, but a few hit close enough to make a light tapping sound against the glass. Roy, still hiding across the street, noticed what we were up to and joined us, grinning. Finally came up with a plan, huh? I was starting to think sitting around and hiding was all you could come up with, Mr. Computer Geek. I rolled my eyes, not taking the bait. Yeah. It's not like they teach us zombie survival 101 in IT class. Roy snorted. So, who are we trying to wake up here anyway? Bren threw another rock, narrowly missing the window frame. The cat lady, he replied, focused on his aim. Roy's patience was wearing thin as he watched Bren miss another throw. He handed his wrench over with a smirk. Here, use this. I guarantee she'll hear it then. Bren shook his head, backing off. And then we'd be dead before she even opened the door. Bren kept tossing rocks, and finally, a small silhouette appeared in the window, a cat. Gwen let out a quiet cheer, encouraging Bren to keep going. He threw another rock, and this time a human figure appeared at the window. Mrs. Castro slowly opened it, peeking out in confusion. We all raised our hands and waved, hoping she'd see us. Finally, she noticed us. Roy and the Adams kids? What are you doing out there? Get inside, it's dangerous. We can't get in, Roy called back. Somebody locked the building. Can you come down and let us in? Miss Castro nodded, a bit flustered. Wait right there, I'll be down in a minute. She disappeared from the window. Just as relief started to settle over us, a guttural snarl sounded from behind, and an infected lunged at Gwen. She screamed, jumping back just in time. Bren tackled the creature, forcing it to the ground as Roy swung his wrench down, ending the threat with a sickening crunch. But our troubles were far from over. Gwen's scream had drawn others' attention. Suddenly, we could hear moans and snarls closing in from both sides. Panic flashed through us as we saw them. 6, maybe 8 on the left, no, at least 10, and just as many on the right. Hold the line, Roy shouted, his face hard with determination as he took position to face the group approaching from the right. I moved to cover the left, my grip tightening on my club, ready for whatever came our way. Bren and Gwen were banging on the door now, shouting for Miss Castro to hurry. Every second felt like a lifetime as the undead closed in, their grotesque, twisted faces illuminated in the pale daylight. Just as I was bracing myself for the worst, we heard it. The shuffling sound of the door unlocking behind us. It swung open, revealing Sean, the building's caretaker. His face was tense but focused as he motioned for us to get inside. "Get in, quickly," he hissed. We didn't need to be told twice. We practically fell through the doorway, and as soon as we were in, Roy and I helped Sean push a heavy cabinet back in front of the door, barricading it once again. Outside, we could hear the frustrated growls of the infected as they swarmed around, but the barricade held. Panting, we all caught our breath, the reality of our close call hitting us hard. Bren and Gwen turned to Miss Castro and Sean, muttering quick words of thanks between gasps. Roy, ever the pragmatist, held up a hand to silence us. "Stay quiet," he whispered. "They're right outside." The group fell silent, each of us holding our breath, listening as the infected clawed and snarled just beyond the door. After what felt like an eternity, the noises began to fade, the creatures apparently losing interest. Once we were sure the infected had moved on, I broke the silence. "Thank you, Sean. Mrs. Castro. We'd be dead if it weren't for you." Sean gave a small nod, scratching the back of his head. "No need to thank me. Mrs. Castro came and knocked on my door, saying you folks were outside. What happened out there?" Roy leaned back against the wall, sighing heavily. "A lot, but let's settle in first. I need some coffee," he said, glancing pointedly at me. A bit of tension broke as I chuckled, nodding. All right, I'll get on it as soon as we're upstairs." Before heading up, Bren introduced Gwen to Mrs. Castro and Sean, giving them a bit of background. Once the introductions were made, everyone started to head toward their apartments. Sean paused by the door. "I'll stay down here and keep an eye out just in case someone else comes knocking." We nodded gratefully, and the four of us made our way up. Mrs. Castro went back into her apartment at second floor. Bren and Gwen went into our apartment, while Roy and I lingered in the hallway a moment longer. Roy turned to me with a rare, serious expression. "You know, Andy, this isn't over, not by a long shot." I met his gaze, feeling the weight of his words. The building felt safe for now, but the world outside had changed, and we had no idea what tomorrow would bring. Let me know in the comments below if you want to hear more from this story. Please like and subscribe. Thank you.